With cultivation and improvement, the ranches must inevitably appreciate in value. There was every chance to make fortunes. When the railroad lands about Bonneville had been thrown open, there had been almost a rush in the matter of settlement, and Broderson, Annixter, Derrick, and Osterman, being foremost with their claims, had secured the pick of the country. But the land once settled upon, the P&S.W. seemed to be in no hurry as to fixing exactly the value of its sections included in the various ranches and offering them for sale. The matter dragged along from year to year, was forgotten for months together, being only brought to mind on such occasions as this, when the rumor spread that the General Office was about to take definite action in the affair. "As soon as the railroad wants to talk business with me," observed Annixter, "about selling me their interest in Quien-Sabe, I'm ready. The land has more than quadrupled in value. I'll bet I could sell it tomorrow for $15 an acre, and if I buy of the railroad for 2.5 an acre, there's boodle in the game." "For 2.5," exclaimed Genslinger. "You don't suppose the railroad will let their land go for any such figure as that, do you? Wherever did you get that idea?" "From the circulars and pamphlets," answered Harron, "that the railroad issued to us when they opened these lands. They are pledged to do that. Even the P&S.W. couldn't break such a pledge as that. You are new in this country, Mr. Genslinger. You don't remember the conditions upon which we took up this land." "And our improvements," exclaimed Annixter. "Why, Magnus and I have put about $5,000 between us into that irrigating ditch already. I guess we are not improving the land just to make it valuable for the railroad people. No matter how much we improve the land or how much it increases in value, they have got to stick by their agreement on the basis of $2.50 per acre. Here's one case where the P&S.W. don't get everything in sight." Genslinger frowned, perplexed. "I am new in the country, as Harron says," he answered, "but it seems to me that there's no fairness in that proposition. The presence of the railroad has helped increase the value of your ranches quite as much as your improvements. Why should you get all the benefit of the rise in value and the railroad nothing? The fair way would be to share it between you." "I don't care anything about that," declared Annixter. "They agreed to charge but $2.50, and they've got to stick to it." "Well," murmured Genslinger, "from what I know of the affair, I don't believe the P&S.W. intends to sell for $2.50 an acre at all. The managers of the road want the best price they can get for everything in these hard times." "Times aren't ever hard for the railroad," hazarded old Broderson. Broderson was the oldest man in the room. He was about 65 years of age, venerable, with a white beard, his figure bent earthwards with hard work. He was a narrow-minded man, painfully conscientious in his statements, lest he should be unjust to somebody. A slow thinker, unable to let a subject drop when once he had started upon it. He had no sooner uttered his remark about hard times than he was moved to qualify it. "Hard times," he repeated, a troubled, perplexed note in his voice. "Well, yes, I suppose the road does have hard times, maybe. Everybody does, of course. I didn't mean that exactly. I believe in being just and fair to everybody. I mean that we've got to use their lines and pay their charges good years and bad years, the P&S.W. being the only road in the state. That is, well, when I say the only road, no, I won't say the only road. Of course there are other roads. There's the D.P.&M. and the San Francisco and North Pacific that runs up to Ukiah. That's not much of a wheat country around Ukiah, though they do grow some wheat there, come to think, but I guess it's too far north. Well, of course, there isn't much, perhaps 60,000 acres in the whole county, if you include barley and oats. I don't know, maybe it's nearer 40,000. I don't remember very well. That's a good many years ago. But Annixter, at the end of all patience, turned to Genslinger, cutting short the old man. "Oh, rot! Of course the railroad would sell at $2.50, he cried. "We've got the contracts." "Look to them, then, Mr. Annixter," retorted Genslinger significantly. "Look to them. Be sure that you are protected." Soon after this, Genslinger took himself away, and Derrick's Chinamen came in to set the table. "What do you suppose he meant?" asked Broderson, when Genslinger was gone. "About this land business?" said Annixter. "Oh, I don't know. Some tomfool idea. Haven't we got their terms printed in black and white in their circulars? There's their pledge." "Oh, as to pledges," murmured Broderson, "the railroad is not always too much hindered by those." "Where is Osterman?" demanded Annixter, abruptly changing the subject as if it were not worth discussion. "Isn't that goat Osterman coming down here tonight?" "You telephoned him, didn't you, Presley?" inquired Magnus. Presley had taken Princess Natalie upon his knee, stroking her long, sleek hair, and the cat, stupefied with beatitude, had closed her eyes to two fine lines, clawing softly at the corduroy of Presley's trousers with alternate paws. "Yes, sir," returned Presley. "He said he would be here." As he spoke, young Osterman arrived. He was a young fellow, but singularly inclined to baldness. His ears, very red and large, stuck out at right angles from either side of his head, and his mouth, too, was large, a great horizontal slit beneath his nose. His cheeks were of a brownish red, the cheekbones a little salient. His face was that of a comic actor, a singer of songs, a man never at a loss for an answer, continually striving to make a laugh. But he took no great interest in ranching, and left the management of his land to his superintendents and foremen, he himself living in Bonneville. He was a poser, a wearer of clothes, forever acting a part, striving to create an impression, to draw attention to himself. He was not without a certain energy, but he devoted it to small ends, to perfecting himself in little accomplishments, continually running after some new thing, incapable of persisting long in any one course. At one moment his mania would be fencing, the next sleight of hand tricks, the next archery. For upwards of 1 month he had devoted himself to learning how to play 2 banjos simultaneously, then, abandoning this, had developed a sudden passion for stamped leather work, and had made a quantity of purses, tennis belts, and hatbands, which he presented to young ladies of his acquaintance. It was his policy never to make an enemy. He was liked far better than he was respected. People spoke of him as that goat Osterman, or that fool Osterman kid, and invited him to dinner. He was of the sort who somehow cannot be ignored. If only because of his clamor, he made himself important. If he had one abiding trait, it was his desire of astonishing people, and in some way best known to himself, managed to cause the circulation of the most extraordinary stories, wherein he himself was the chief actor. He was glib, voluble, dexterous, ubiquitous, a teller of funny stories, a cracker of jokes. Naturally enough, he was heavily in debt, but carried the burden of it with perfect nonchalance. The year before, S. Behrman had held mortgages for fully 1/3 of his crop, and had squeezed him viciously for interest. But for all that, Osterman and S. Behrman were continually seen arm in arm on the main street of Bonneville. Osterman was accustomed to slap S. Behrman on his fat back, declaring, "You're a good fellow, old jelly-belly, after all, hey?" As Osterman entered from the porch after hanging his cavalry poncho and dripping hat on the rack outside, Mrs. Derrick appeared in the door that opened from the dining-room into the glass-roofed hallway just beyond. Osterman saluted her with effusive cordiality and with ingratiating blandness. "I am not going to stay," she explained, smiling pleasantly at the group of men, her pretty, wide-open brown eyes, with their look of inquiry and innocence, glancing from face to face. "I only came to see if you wanted anything, and to say how do you do." She began talking to old Broderson, making inquiries as to his wife, who had been sick the last week, and Osterman turned to the company, shaking hands all around, keeping up an incessant stream of conversation. "Hello, boys and girls. Hello, Governor. Sort of a gathering of the clans tonight. Well, if here isn't that man Annixter. Hello, Buck. What do you know? Kind of dusty out tonight." At once Annixter began to get red in the face, retiring toward a corner of the room, standing in an awkward position by the case of stuffed birds, shambling and confused while Mrs. Derrick was present, standing rigidly on both feet, his elbows close to his sides. But he was angry with Osterman, muttering imprecations to himself, horribly vexed that the young fellow should call him Buck before Magnus' wife. This goat Osterman. Hadn't he any sense, that fool? Couldn't he ever learn how to behave before a female? Calling him Buck like that while Mrs. Derrick was there. Why, a stable boy would know better. A hired man would have better manners. All through the dinner that followed, Annixter was out of sorts, sulking in his place, refusing to eat by way of vindicating his self-respect, resolving to bring Osterman up with a sharp turn if he called him Buck again. The Chinaman had made a certain kind of plum pudding for dessert, and Annixter, who remembered other dinners at the Derricks, had been saving himself for this, and had meditated upon it all through the meal. No doubt it would restore all his good humour, and he believed his stomach was so far recovered as to be able to stand it. But unfortunately the pudding was served with a sauce that he abhorred, a thick, gruel-like, colourless mixture made from plain water and sugar. Before he could interfere, the Chinaman had poured a quantity of it upon his plate. "Ah!" exclaimed Annixter, "it makes me sick. Such sloop! Take it away. I'll have mine straight, if you don't mind." "That's good for your stomach, Buck," observed young Osterman. "Makes it go down sort of slick, don't you see? Sloop, eh? That's a good name." "Look here, don't you call me Buck. You don't seem to have any sense, and besides, it isn't good for my stomach. I know better. What do you know about my stomach, anyhow? Just looking at sloop like that makes me sick." A little while after this the Chinaman cleared away the dessert and brought in coffee and cigars. The whiskey bottle and the siphon of soda water reappeared. The men eased themselves in their places, pushing back from the table, lighting their cigars, talking of the beginning of the rains and the prospects of a rise in wheat. Broderson began an elaborate mental calculation, trying to settle in his mind the exact date of his visit to Ukiah, and Osterman did sleight-of-hand tricks with bread pills. But Princess Natalie, the cat, was uneasy. Annixter was occupying her own particular chair in which she slept every night. She could not go to sleep, but spied upon him continually, watching his every movement with her lambent yellow eyes, clear as amber. Then at length Magnus, who was at the head of the table, moved in his place, assuming a certain magisterial attitude. "Well, gentlemen," he observed, "I have lost my case against the railroad, the grain rate case. Ulsteen decided against me, and now I hear rumors to the effect that rates for the hauling of grain are to be advanced." When Magnus had finished, there was a moment's silence, each member of the group maintaining his attitude of attention and interest. It was Harron who first spoke. "S. Behrman manipulated the whole affair. There's a big deal of some kind in the air, and if there is, we all know who is back of it. S. Behrman, of course, but who's back of him? It's Shelgrim." Shelgrim. The name fell squarely in the midst of the conversation, abrupt, grave, somber, big with suggestion, pregnant with huge associations. No one in the group who was not familiar with it. No one, for that matter, in the county, the state, the whole reach of the West, the entire Union, that did not entertain convictions as to the man who carried it. A giant figure in the end-of-the-century finance, a product of circumstance, an inevitable result of conditions, characteristic, typical, symbolic of ungovernable forces. In the new movement, the new finance, the reorganization of capital, the amalgamation of powers, the consolidation of enormous enterprises, no one individual was more constantly in the eye of the world. No one was more hated, more dreaded, no one more compelling of unwilling tribute to his commanding genius, to the colossal intellect operating the width of an entire continent, than the president and owner of the Pacific and Southwestern. "I don't think, however, he has moved yet," said Magnus. "The thing for us, then," exclaimed Osterman, "is to stand from under before he does." "Moved yet?" snorted Annixter. "He's probably moved so long ago that we've never noticed it." "In any case," hazarded Magnus, "it is scarcely probable that the deal, whatever it is to be, has been consummated. If we act quickly, there may be a chance." "Act quickly? How?" demanded Annixter. "Good Lord, what can you do? We're cinched already. It all amounts to just this. You can't buck against the railroad. We've tried it, and we are stuck every time. You yourself, Derrick, have just lost your grain rate case. S. Behrman did you up. Shelgrim owns the courts. He's got men like Ulsteen in his pocket. He's got the Railroad Commission in his pocket. He's got the governor of the state in his pocket. He keeps $1 million lobby at Sacramento every minute of the time the legislature is in session. He's got his own men on the floor of the United States Senate. He has the whole thing organized like an army corps. What are you going to do? He sits in his office in San Francisco and pulls the strings, and we've got to dance." But, hazarded Broderson, "but there's the Interstate Commerce Commission. At least on long-haul rates they—" "Oh, yes, the Interstate Commerce Commission," shouted Annixter scornfully. "That's great, ain't it? The greatest Punch and Judy show on earth. It's almost as good as the Railroad Commission. There never was and there never will be a California Railroad Commission not in the pay of the P&S.W." "It is to the Railroad Commission, nevertheless," remarked Magnus, "that the people of the state must look for relief. That is our only hope. Once elect commissioners who would be loyal to the people, and the whole system of excessive rates falls to the ground." "Well, why not have a railroad commission of our own, then?" suddenly declared young Osterman. "Because it can't be done," retorted Annixter. "You can't buck against the railroad, and if you could, you can't organize the farmers in the San Joaquin. We tried it once, and it was enough to turn your stomach. The railroad quietly bought delegates through S. Behrman and did us up." "Well, that's the game to play," said Osterman decisively. "Buy delegates." "It's the only game that seems to win," admitted Harron gloomily. "Or ever will win," exclaimed Osterman, a sudden excitement seeming to take possession of him. His face, the face of a comic actor, with its great slit of mouth and stiff red ears, went abruptly pink. "Look here," he cried, "this thing is getting desperate. We've fought and fought in the courts and out, and we've tried agitation and all the rest of it, and S. Behrman sacks us every time. Now comes the time when there's a prospect of a big crop. We've had no rain for 2 years, and the land has had a long rest. If there is any rain at all this winter, we'll have a bonanza year. And just at this very moment, when we've got our chance, a chance to pay off our mortgages and get clear of debt and make a strike, here is Shelgrim making a deal to cinch us and put up rates. And now here's the primaries coming off, and a new railroad commission going in. That's why Shelgrim chose this time to make his deal. If we wait till Shelgrim pulls it off, we're done for. That's flat. I tell you, we're in a fix if we don't keep an eye open. Things are getting desperate. Magnus has just said that the key to the whole thing is the Railroad Commission. Well, why not have a commission of our own? Never mind how we get it, let's get it. If it's got to be bought, let's buy it and put our own men on it and dictate what the rates will be. Suppose it costs $100,000. Well, we'll get back more than that in cheap rates." "Mr. Osterman," said Magnus, fixing the young man with a swift glance, "Mr. Osterman, you are proposing a scheme of bribery, sir." "I am proposing," repeated Osterman, "a scheme of bribery. Exactly so." "And a crazy, wild-eyed scheme at that," said Annixter gruffly. "Even supposing you bought a railroad commission and got your schedule of low rates, what happens? The P&S.W. crowd would get out an injunction and tie you up." "They would tie themselves up, too. Hauling at low rates is better than no hauling at all. The wheat has got to be moved." "Oh, rot!" cried Annixter. "Aren't you ever going to learn any sense? Don't you know that cheap transportation would benefit the Liverpool buyers and not us? Can't it be fed into you that you can't buck against the railroad? When you try to buy a board of commissioners, don't you see that you'll have to bid against the railroad, bid against a corporation that can chuck out millions to our thousands? Do you think you can bid against the P&S.W.? The railroad don't need to know we are in the game against them till we've got our men seated. And when you've got them seated, what's to prevent the corporation buying them right over your head?" "If we've got the right kind of men in, they could not be bought that way," interposed Harron. "I don't know but what there's something in what Osterman says. We'd have the naming of the commission, and we'd name honest men." Annixter struck the table with his fist in exasperation. "Honest men," he shouted. "The kind of men you could get to go into such a scheme would have to be dishonest to begin with." Roderson, shifting uneasily in his place, fingering his beard with a vague, uncertain gesture, spoke again. "It would be the chance of them, our commissioners, selling out against the certainty of Shelgrim doing us up. That is," he hastened to add, "almost a certainty, pretty near a certainty." "Of course it would be a chance," exclaimed Osterman, "but it's come to the point where we've got to take chances, risk a big stake to make a big strike, and risk is better than sure failure." "I can be no party to a scheme of avowed bribery and corruption, Mr. Osterman," declared Magnus, a ring of severity in his voice. "I am surprised, sir, that you should even broach the subject in my hearing." "And," cried Annixter, "it can't be done." "I don't know," muttered Harron. "Maybe it just wants a little spark like this to fire the whole train." Magnus glanced at his son in considerable surprise. He had not expected this of Harron. But so great was his affection for his son, so accustomed had he become to listening to his advice, to respecting his opinions, that for the moment, after the first shock of surprise and disappointment, he was influenced to give a certain degree of attention to this new proposition. He in no way countenanced it. At any moment he was prepared to rise in his place and denounce it and Osterman both. It was trickery of the most contemptible order, a thing he believed to be unknown to the old school of politics and statesmanship to which he was proud to belong. But since Harron, even for one moment, considered it, he, Magnus, who trusted Harron implicitly, would do likewise, if it was only to oppose and defeat it in its very beginnings. And abruptly the discussion began. Gradually Osterman, by dint of his clamor, his strident reiteration, the plausibility of his glib, ready assertions, the ease with which he extricated himself when apparently driven to a corner, completely won over old Broderson to his way of thinking. Osterman bewildered him with his volubility, the lightning rapidity with which he leaped from one subject to another, garrulous, witty, flamboyant, terrifying the old man with pictures of the swift approach of ruin, the imminence of danger. Annixter, who led the argument against him, loving argument though he did, appeared to poor advantage, unable to present his side effectively. He called Osterman a fool, a goat, a senseless, crazy-headed jackass, but was unable to refute his assertions. His debate was the clumsy heaving of brickbats, brutal, direct. He contradicted everything Osterman said as a matter of principle, made conflicting assertions, declarations that were absolutely inconsistent, and when Osterman or Harron used these against him could only exclaim, "Well, in a way it's so, and then again in a way it isn't." But suddenly Osterman discovered a new argument. "If we swing this deal," he cried, "we've got old Jelly-Belly Behrman right where we want him." "He's the man that does us every time," cried Harron. "If there is dirty work to be done in which the railroad doesn't wish to appear, it is S. Behrman who does it. If the freight rates are to be adjusted to squeeze us a little harder, it is S. Behrman who regulates what we can stand. If there's a judge to be bought, it is S. Behrman who does the bargaining. If there is a jury to be bribed, it is S. Behrman who handles the money. If there is an election to be jobbed, it is S. Behrman who manipulates it. It's Behrman here and Behrman there. It is Behrman we come against every time we make a move. It is Behrman who has the grip of us and will never let go till he has squeezed us bone dry. Why, when I think of it all sometimes, I wonder I keep my hands off the man." Osterman got on his feet. Leaning across the table, gesturing wildly with his right hand, his serio-comic face, with its bald forehead and stiff red ears, was inflamed with excitement. He took the floor, creating an impression, attracting all attention to himself, playing to the gallery, gesticulating, clamorous, full of noise. "Now is your chance to get even," he vociferated. "It is now or never. You can take it and save the situation for yourselves and all California, or you can leave it and rot on your own ranches. Buck, I know you. I know you're not afraid of anything that wears skin. I know you've got sand all through you. And I know if I showed you how we could put our deal through and seat a commission of our own, you wouldn't hang back. Governor, you're a brave man. You know the advantage of prompt and fearless action. You are not the sort to shrink from taking chances. To play for big stakes is just your game, to stake a fortune on the turn of a card. You didn't get the reputation of being the strongest poker player in El Dorado County for nothing. Now here's the biggest gamble that ever came your way. If we stand up to it like men with guts in us, we'll win out. If we hesitate, we're lost." "I don't suppose you can help playing the goat, Osterman," remarked Annixter, "but what's your idea? What do you think we can do? I'm not saying," he hastened to interpose, "that you've always convinced me by all this cackling. I know as well as you that we are in a hole, but I knew that before I came here tonight. You've not done anything to make me change my mind. But just what do you propose? Let's hear it." "Well, I say the first thing to do is to see Disbrow. He's the political boss of the Denver, Pueblo, and Mojave Road. We will have to get in with the machine some way, and that's particularly why I want Magnus with us. He knows politics better than any of us, and if we don't want to get sold again, we will have to have someone that's in the know to steer us." "The only politics I understand, Mr. Osterman," answered Magnus sternly, "are honest politics. You must look elsewhere for your political manager. I refuse to have any part in this matter. If the Railroad Commission can be nominated legitimately, if your arrangements can be made without bribery, I am with you to the last iota of my ability." "Well, you can't get what you want without paying for it," contradicted Annixter. Broderson was about to speak when Osterman kicked his foot under the table. He himself held his peace. He was quick to see that if he could involve Magnus and Annixter in an argument, Annixter, for the mere love of contention, would oppose the governor, and, without knowing it, would commit himself to his, Osterman's, scheme. This was precisely what happened. In a few moments Annixter was declaring at top voice his readiness to mortgage the crop of Quien-Sabe, if necessary, for the sake of busting S. Behrman. He could see no great obstacle in the way of controlling the nominating convention so far as securing the naming of 2 railroad commissioners was concerned. 2 was all they needed. Probably it would cost money. You didn't get something for nothing. It would cost them all a good deal more if they sat like lumps on a log and played tiddlywinks while Shelgrim sold out from under them. Then there was this, too. The P&S.W. were hard up just then. The shortage on the state's wheat crop for the last 2 years had affected them, too. They were retrenching in expenditures all along the line. Hadn't they just cut wages in all departments? There was this affair of dikes to prove it. The railroad didn't always act as a unit, either. There was always a party in it that opposed spending too much money. He would bet that party was strong just now. He was kind of sick himself of being kicked by S. Behrman. Hadn't that pip turned up on his ranch that very day to bully him about his own line fence? Next he would be telling him what kind of clothes he ought to wear. Aaron had the right idea. Somebody had got to be busted mighty soon now, and he didn't propose that it should be he. "Now you were talking something like sense," observed Osterman. "I thought you would see it like that when you got my idea." "Your idea? Your idea?" cried Annixter. "Why, I've had this idea myself for over 3 years." "What about Disbrow?" asked Harron, hastening to interrupt. "Why do we want to see Disbrow?" "Disbrow is the political man for the Denver, Pueblo, and Mojave," answered Osterman. "And you see it's like this. The Mojave road don't run up into the valley at all. Their terminus is way to the south of us, and they don't care anything about grain rates through the San Joaquin. They don't care how anti-railroad the Commission is, because the Commission's rulings can't affect them. But they divide traffic with the P&S.W. in the southern part of the state, and they have a good deal of influence with that road. I want to get the Mojave road through Disbrow to recommend a commissioner of our choosing to the P&S.W. and have the P&S.W. adopt him as their own." "Who, for instance?" "Darrell, that Los Angeles man, remember?" "Well, Darrell is no particular friend of Disbrow," said Annixter. "Why should Disbrow take him up?" "Precisely," cried Osterman. "We make it worth Disbrow's while to do it. We go to him and say, 'Mr. Disbrow, you manage the politics for the Mojave Railroad, and what you say goes with your board of directors. We want you to adopt our candidate for railroad commissioner for the 3rd District. How much do you want for doing it? I know we can buy Disbrow. That gives us 1 commissioner. We need not bother about that any more. In the 1st District we don't make any move at all. We let the political managers of the P&S.W. nominate whoever they like. Then we concentrate all our efforts to putting in our man in the 2nd District. There is where the big fight will come." "I see perfectly well what you mean, Mr. Osterman," observed Magnus, "but make no mistake, sir, as to my attitude in this business. You may count me as out of it entirely." "Well, suppose we win," put in Annixter truculently, already acknowledging himself as involved in the proposed undertaking. "Suppose we win and get low rates for hauling grain. How about you then? You count yourself in then, don't you? You get all the benefits of lower rate without sharing any of the risks we take to secure them. No, nor any of the expense either. No, you won't dirty your fingers with helping us put this deal through, but you won't be so cursed particular when it comes to sharing the profits, will you?" Magnus rose abruptly to his full height, the nostrils of his thin, hawk-like nose vibrating, his smooth-shaven face paler than ever, "Stop right where you are, sir," he exclaimed. "You forget yourself, Mr. Annixter. Please understand that I tolerate such words as you have permitted yourself to make use of from no man, not even from my guest. I shall ask you to apologize." In an instant he dominated the entire group, imposing a respect that was as much fear as admiration. No one made response. For the moment he was the master again, the leader. Like so many delinquent schoolboys, the others cowered before him, ashamed, put to confusion, unable to find their tongues. In that brief instant of silence following upon Magnus' outburst, and while he held them subdued and overmastered, the fabric of their scheme of corruption and dishonesty trembled to its base. It was the last protest of the old school, rising up there in denunciation of the new order of things, the statesman opposed to the politician, honesty, rectitude, uncompromising integrity prevailing for the last time against the devious maneuvering, the evil communications, the rotten expediency of a corrupted institution. For a few seconds no one answered. Then Annixter, moving abruptly and uneasily in his place, muttered, "I spoke upon provocation. If you like, we'll consider it unsaid. I don't know what's going to become of us. Go out of business, I presume." "I understand Magnus all right," put in Osterman. "He don't have to go into this thing if it's against his conscience. That's all right. Magnus can stay out if he wants to, but that won't prevent us going ahead and seeing what we can do. Only there's this about it." He turned again to Magnus, speaking with every degree of earnestness, every appearance of conviction. "I did not deny, Governor, from the very start that this would mean bribery. But you don't suppose that I like the idea either. If there was one legitimate hope that was yet left untried, no matter how forlorn it was, I would try it. But there's not. It is literally and soberly true that every means of help, every honest means, has been attempted. Shelgrim is going to cinch us. Grain rates are increasing, while on the other hand the price of wheat is sagging lower and lower all the time. If we don't do something, we are ruined." Osterman paused for a moment, allowing precisely the right number of seconds to elapse, then altering and lowering his voice, added, "I respect the governor's principles. I admire them. They do him every degree of credit." Then, turning directly to Magnus, he concluded with, "But I only want you to ask yourself, sir, if, at such a crisis, one ought to think of oneself, to consider purely personal motives in such a desperate situation as this. Now, we want you with us, Governor. Perhaps not openly, if you don't wish it, but tacitly at least. I won't ask you for an answer tonight, but what I do ask of you is to consider this matter seriously and think over the whole business. Will you do it?" Osterman ceased definitely to speak, leaning forward across the table, his eyes fixed on Magnus' face. There was a silence. Outside the rain fell continually with an even, monotonous murmur. In the group of men around the table no one stirred or spoke. They looked steadily at Magnus, who, for the moment, kept his glance fixed thoughtfully upon the table before him. In another moment he raised his head and looked from face to face around the group. After all, these were his neighbors, his friends, men with whom he had been upon the closest terms of association. In a way, they represented what now had come to be his world. His single, swift glance took in the men, one after another. Annixter, rugged, crude, sitting awkwardly and uncomfortably in his chair, his unhandsome face, with its outthrust lower lip and deeply cleft masculine chin, flushed and eager, his yellow hair disordered, the one tuft on the crown standing stiffly forth like the feather in an Indian's scalp-lock. Broderson, vaguely combing at his long beard with a persistent maniacal gesture, distressed, troubled, and uneasy. Osterman, with his comedy face, the face of a music-hall singer, his head bald and set off by his great red ears, leaning back in his place, softly cracking the knuckle of a forefinger. And last of all, and close to his elbow, his son, his support, his confidant and companion, Heron, so like himself, with his own erect, fine carriage, his thin, beak-like nose, and his blond hair with its tendency to curl in a forward direction in front of the ears, young, strong, courageous, full of the promise of the future years. His blue eyes looked straight into his father's with what Magnus could fancy a glance of appeal. Magnus could see that expression in the faces of the others very plainly. They looked to him as their natural leader, their chief who was to bring them out from this abominable trouble which was closing in upon them, and in them all he saw many types. These men around his table on that night of the first rain of a coming season, seemed to stand in his imagination for many others, all the farmers, ranchers, and wheat growers of the great San Joaquin. Their words were the words of a whole community, their distress the distress of an entire state, harried beyond the bounds of endurance, driven to the wall, coerced, exploited, harassed to the limits of exasperation. "I will think of it," he said, then hastened to add, "but I can tell you beforehand that you may expect only a refusal." After Magnus had spoken, there was a prolonged silence. The conference seemed of itself to have come to an end for that evening. Presley lighted another cigarette from the butt of one he had been smoking, and the cat, Princess Natalie, disturbed by his movement and by a whiff of drifting smoke, jumped from his knees to the floor, and picking her way across the room to Annixter, rubbed gently against his legs, her tail in the air, her back delicately arched. No doubt she thought it time to settle herself for the night, and as Annixter gave no indication of vacating his chair, she chose this way of cajoling him into ceding his place to her. But Annixter was irritated at the Prince's attentions, misunderstanding their motive. "Get out!" he exclaimed, lifting his feet to the rung of the chair. "Lord love me, but I sure do hate a cat." "By the way," observed Osterman, "I passed Genslinger by the gate as I came in tonight. Had he been here?" "Yes, he was here," said Harron, but Annixter took the words out of his mouth. "He says there's some talk of the railroad selling us their sections this winter." "Oh, he did he?" exclaimed Osterman, interested at once. "Where did he hear that?" "Where does a railroad paper get its news? From the general office, I suppose." "I hope he didn't get it straight from headquarters that the land was to be graded at $20 an acre," murmured Broderson. "What's that?" demanded Osterman. $20? Here, put me on, somebody. What's all up? What did Genslinger say?" "Oh, you needn't get scared," said Annixter. "Genslinger don't know, that's all. He thinks there was no understanding that the price of the land should not be advanced when the P&S.W. came to sell to us." "Oh," muttered Osterman, relieved. Magnus, who had gone out into the office on the other side of the glass-roofed hallway, returned with a long yellow envelope in his hand, stuffed with newspaper clippings and thin, closely printed pamphlets. "Here is the circular," he remarked, drawing out one of the pamphlets. "The conditions of settlement to which the railroad obligated itself are very explicit." He ran over the pages of the circular, then read aloud. "The company invites settlers to go up on its lands before patents are issued or the road is completed, and intends in such cases to sell to them in preference to any other applicants and at a price based upon the value of the land without improvements." And on the other page here, he remarked, "They refer to this again. In ascertaining the value of the lands, any improvements that a settler or any other person may have on the lands will not be taken into consideration, neither will the price be increased in consequence thereof. Settlers are thus ensured that in addition to being accorded the first privilege of purchase at the graded price, they will also be protected in their improvements." And here, he commented, in Section 9 it reads, "The lands are not uniform in price, but are offered at various figures from $2.50 upward per acre. Usually land covered with tall timber is held at $5 per acre, and that with pine at $10. Most is for sale at $2.50 and $5. "When you come to read that carefully," hazarded old Broderson, it's not so very reassuring. Most is for sale at $2.50 an acre, it says. That don't mean all. That only means some. I wish now that I had secured a more ironclad agreement from the P&S.W. when I took up its sections on my ranch, and Genslinger is in a position to know the intentions of the railroad. At least he is in touch with them. All newspaper men are. Those, I mean, who are subsidized by the general office. But perhaps Genslinger isn't subsidized. I don't know. I am not sure. Maybe, perhaps—" "Oh, you don't know, and you do know, and maybe and perhaps, and you're not so sure," vociferated Annixter. How about ignoring the value of our improvements? Nothing hazy about that statement, I guess. It says in so many words that any improvements we make will not be considered when the land is appraised, and that's the same thing, isn't it? The unimproved land is worth $2.50 an acre. Only timberland is worth more, and there's none too much timber about here. Well, one thing at a time, said Harron. The thing for us now is to get into this primary election and the convention and see if we can push our men for railroad commissioners. Right, declared Annixter. He rose, stretching his arms above his head. I've about talked all the wind out of me, he said. Think I'll be moving along. It's pretty near midnight. But when Magnus' guests turned their attention to the matter of returning to their different ranches, they abruptly realized that the downpour had doubled and trebled in its volume since earlier in the evening. The fields and roads were veritable seas of viscid mud, the night absolutely black dark, assuredly not a night in which to venture out. Magnus insisted that the three ranchers should put up at Los Muertos. Osterman accepted at once. Annixter, after an interminable discussion, allowed himself to be persuaded in the end, accepting as though granting a favor. Broderson protested that his wife, who was not well, would expect him to return that night, and would, no doubt, fret if he did not appear. Furthermore, he lived close by, at the junction of the county and lower road. He put a sack over his head and shoulders, persistently declining Magnus' offered umbrella and rubber coat, and hurried away, remarking that he had no foreman on his ranch and had to be up and about at 5 the next morning to put his men to work. Fool, muttered Annixter when the old man had gone. Imagine farming a ranch the size of his without a foreman. Harron showed Osterman and Annixter where they were to sleep in adjoining rooms. Magnus soon afterward retired. Osterman found an excuse for going to bed, but Annixter and Harron remained in the latter's room in a haze of blue tobacco smoke, talking. But at length, at the end of all argument, Annixter got up, remarking, "Well, I'm going to turn in. It's nearly 2:00. He went to his room, closing the door, and Harron, opening his window to clear out the tobacco smoke, looked out for a moment across the country, toward the south. The darkness was profound, impenetrable. The rain fell with an uninterrupted roar. Near at hand one could hear the sound of dripping eaves and foliage and the eager sucking sound of the drinking earth. And abruptly, while Harron stood looking out, one hand upon the upraised sash, a great puff of the outside air invaded the room, odorous with the reek of the soaking earth, redolent with fertility, pungent, heavy, tepid. He closed the window again and sat for a few moments on the edge of the bed, one shoe in his hand, thoughtful and absorbed, wondering if his father would involve himself in this new scheme, wondering if, after all, he wanted him to. But suddenly he was aware of a commotion issuing from the direction of Annixter's room, and the voice of Annixter himself upraised in expostulation and exasperation. The door of the room to which Annixter had been assigned opened with a violent wrench, and an angry voice exclaimed to anybody who would listen, "Oh, yes, funny, isn't it? In a way it's funny, and then again, in a way it isn't." The door banged to, so that all the windows of the house rattled in their frames. Harron hurried out into the dining room, and there met Presley and his father, who had been aroused as well by Annixter's clamor. Osterman was there, too, his bald head gleaming like a bulb of ivory in the light of the lamp that Magnus carried. "What's all up?" demanded Osterman. "Whatever in the world is the matter with Buck?" Confused and terrible sounds came from behind the door of Annixter's room. A prolonged monologue of grievance, broken by explosions of wrath and the vague noise of someone in a furious hurry. All at once, and before Harron had a chance to knock on the door, Annixter flung it open. His face was blazing with anger, his outthrust lip more prominent than ever, his wiry yellow hair in disarray, the tuft on the crown sticking straight into the air like the upraised hackles of an angry hound. Evidently he had been dressing himself with the most headlong rapidity. He had not yet put on his coat and vest, but carried them over his arm, while with his disengaged hand he kept hitching his suspenders over his shoulders with a persistent and hypnotic gesture. Evidently he had been dressing himself with the most headlong rapidity. He had not yet put on his coat and vest, but carried them over his arm, while with his disengaged hand he kept hitching his suspenders over his shoulders with a persistent and hypnotic gesture. Without a moment's pause, he gave vent to his indignation in a torrent of words. "Ah, yes, in my bed. Sloop. Aha! I know the man who put it there," he went on, glaring at Osterman, "and that man is a pip. Sloop. Slimy, disgusting stuff. You heard me say I didn't like it when the Chink passed it to me at dinner. And just for that reason you put it in my bed, and I stick my feet into it when I turn in. Funny, isn't it? Oh, yes, too funny for any use. I'd laugh a little louder if I was you." "Well, Buck," protested Harron, as he noticed the hat in Annixter's hand, "you're not going home just for—" Annixter turned on him with a shout. "I'll get plumb out of here," he trumpeted. "I won't stay here another minute." He swung into his waistcoat and coat, scrabbling at the buttons in the violence of his emotions. "And I don't know but what it will make me sick again to go out in a night like this. No, I won't stay. Some things are funny, and then, again, there are some things that are not. Ah, yes, sloop. Well, that's all right. I can be funny, too, when you come to that. You don't get a cent of money out of me. You can do your own dirty bribery in your own dirty way. I won't come into this scheme at all. I wash my hands of the whole business. It's rotten and it's wild-eyed. It's dirt from start to finish, and you'll all land in state's prison. You can count me out." "But, Buck, look here, you crazy fool," cried Harron. "I don't know who put that stuff in your bed, but I'm not going to let you go back to Keonsabe in a rain like this." "I know who put it in," clamored the other, shaking his fist, "and don't call me Buck, and I'll do as I please. I will go back home. I'll get plumb out of here. Sorry I came. Sorry I ever lent myself to such a disgusting, dishonest, dirty bribery game as this all tonight. I won't put a dime into it. No, not a penny." He stormed to the door leading out upon the porch, deaf to all reason. Harron and Presley followed him, trying to dissuade him from going home at that time of night and in such a storm, but Annixter was not to be placated. He stamped across to the barn where his horse and buggy had been stabled, splashing through the puddles underfoot, going out of his way to drench himself, refusing even to allow Presley and Harron to help him harness the horse. "What's the use of making a fool of yourself, Annixter?" remonstrated Presley, as Annixter backed the horse from the stall. "You act just like a 10-year-old boy. If Osterman wants to play the goat, why should you help him out?" "He's a pip," vociferated Annixter. "You don't understand, Presley. It runs in my family to hate anything sticky. It's heredity. How would you like to get into bed at 2 a.m. and jam your feet down into a slimy mess like that? Oh, no, it's not so funny then. And mark my words, Mr. Harron Derrick," he continued as he climbed into the buggy, shaking the whip toward Harron, "this business we talked over tonight, I'm out of it. It's yellow. It's too cursed dishonest." He cut the horse across the back with the whip and drove out into the pelting rain. In a few seconds the sound of his buggy wheels was lost in the muffled roar of the downpour. Harron and Presley closed the barn and returned to the house, sheltering themselves under a tarpaulin carriage cover. Once inside, Harron went to remonstrate with Osterman, who was still up. Magnus had again retired. The house had fallen quiet again. As Presley crossed the dining room on the way to his own apartment in the second story of the house, he paused for a moment, looking about him. In the dull light of the lowered lamps, the redwood paneling of the room showed a dark crimson as though stained with blood. On the massive slab of the dining table, the half-emptied glasses and bottles stood about in the confusion in which they had been left, reflecting themselves deep into the polished wood. The glass doors of the case of stuffed birds was a subdued shimmer. The many-colored Navajo blanket over the couch seemed a mere patch of brown. Around the table, the chairs in which the men had sat throughout the evening still ranged themselves in a semicircle, vaguely suggestive of the conference of the past few hours, with all its possibilities of good and evil, its significance of a future big with portent. The room was still. Only on the cushions of the chair that Annixter had occupied, the cat, Princess Natalie, at last comfortably settled in her accustomed place, dozed complacently, her paws tucked under her breast, filling the deserted room with the subdued murmur of her contented purr. Chapter 4. On the Quien Ranch, in one of its western divisions, near the line fence that divided it from the Osterman holding, Vanamee was harnessing the horses to the plow to which he had been assigned 2 days before, a stable boy from the division barn helping him. Promptly discharged from the employ of the sheep raisers after the lamentable accident near the Long Trestle, Vanamee had presented himself to Harron, asking for employment. The season was beginning. On all the ranches work was being resumed. The rain had put the ground into admirable condition for plowing, and Annixter, Broderson, and Osterman all had their gangs at work. Thus Vanamee was vastly surprised to find Los Muertos idle, the horses still in the barns, the men gathering in the shade of the bunkhouse and eating-house, smoking, dozing, or going aimlessly about, their arms dangling. The plows for which Magnus and Harron were waiting in a fury of impatience had not yet arrived, and since the management of Los Muertos had counted upon having these in hand long before this time, no provision had been made for keeping the old stock in repair. Many of these old plows were useless, broken, and out of order. Some had been sold. It could not be said definitely when the new plows would arrive. Harron had decided to wait 1 week longer, and then, in case of their non-appearance, to buy a consignment of the old style of plow from the dealers in Bonneville. He could afford to lose the money better than he could afford to lose the season. Failing of work on Los Muertos, Vanamee had gone to Quien Sabe. Annixter, whom he had spoken to first, had sent him across the ranch to one of his division superintendents, and this latter, after assuring himself of Vanamee's familiarity with horses and his previous experience, even though somewhat remote, on Los Muertos, had taken him on as a driver of one of the gang plows, then at work on his division. The evening before, when the foreman had blown his whistle at 6 o'clock, the long line of plows had halted upon the instant, and the drivers, unharnessing their teams, had taken them back to the division barns, leaving the plows as they were in the furrows. But an hour after daylight the next morning the work was resumed. After breakfast, Vanamee, riding one horse and leading the others, had returned to the line of plows together with the other drivers. Now he was busy harnessing the team. At the division blacksmith shop, temporarily put up, he had been obliged to wait while one of his lead horses was shod, and he had thus been delayed quite 5 minutes. Nearly all the other teams were harnessed, the drivers on their seats, waiting for the foreman's signal. "All ready here?" inquired the foreman, driving up to Vanamee's team in his buggy. "All ready, sir," answered Vanamee, buckling the last strap. He climbed to his seat, shaking out the reins, and turning about, looked back along the line, then all around him at the landscape inundated with the brilliant glow of the early morning. The day was fine. Since the first rain of the season there had been no other. Now the sky was without a cloud, pale blue, delicate, luminous, scintillating with morning. The great brown earth turned a huge flank to it, exhaling the moisture of the early dew. The atmosphere, washed clean of dust and mist, was translucent as crystal. Far off to the east, the hills on the other side of Broderson Creek stood out against the pallid saffron of the horizon, as flat and as sharply outlined as if pasted on the sky. The campanile of the ancient mission of San Juan seemed as fine as frostwork. All about between the horizons, the carpet of the land unrolled itself to infinity. But now it was no longer parched with heat, cracked and warped by a merciless sun, powdered with dust. The rain had done its work. Not a clod that was not swollen with fertility, not a fissure that did not exhale the sense of fecundity. One could not take a dozen steps upon the ranches without the brusque sensation that underfoot the land was alive, aroused at last from its sleep, palpitating with the desire of reproduction. Deep down there in the recesses of the soil, the great heart throbbed once more, thrilling with passion, vibrating with desire, offering itself to the caress of the plow, insistent, eager, imperious. Dimly one felt the deep-seated trouble of the earth, the uneasy agitation of its members, the hidden tumult of its womb, demanding to be made fruitful, to reproduce, to disengage the eternal renascent germ of life that stirred and struggled in its loins. The plows, 35 in number, each drawn by its team of 10, stretched in an interminable line, nearly a quarter of a mile in length, behind and ahead of Vanamee. They were arranged, as it were, en echelon, not in file, not one directly behind the other, but each succeeding plow its own width farther in the field than the one in front of it. Each of these plows held 5 shears, so that when the entire company was in motion, 175 furrows were made at the same instant. At a distance the plows resembled a great column of field artillery. Each driver was in his place, his glance alternating between his horses and the foreman nearest at hand. Other foremen, in their buggies or buckboards, were at intervals along the line like battery lieutenants. Annixter himself, on horseback, in boots and campaign hat, a cigar in his teeth, overlooked the scene. The division superintendent, on the opposite side of the line, galloped past to a position at the head. For a long moment there was a silence. A sense of preparedness ran from end to end of the column. All things were ready, each man in his place. The day's work was about to begin. Suddenly, from a distance at the head of the line, came the shrill trilling of a whistle. At once the foreman nearest Vanamee repeated it, at the same time turning down the line and waving one arm. The signal was repeated, whistle answering whistle, till the sounds lost themselves in the distance. At once the line of plows lost its immobility, moving forward, getting slowly under way, the horses straining in the traces. A prolonged movement rippled from team to team, disengaging in its passage a multitude of sounds: the click of buckles, the creak of straining leather, the subdued clash of machinery, the cracking of whips, the deep breathing of nearly 400 horses, the abrupt commands and cries of the drivers, and last of all the prolonged, soothing murmur of the thick brown earth turning steadily from the multitude of advancing shears. The ploughing thus commenced continued. The sun rose higher. Steadily the 100 iron hands kneaded and furrowed and stroked the brown, humid earth. The 100 iron teeth bit deep into the Titan's flesh. Perched on his seat, the moist, living reins slipping and tugging in his hands, Vanamee, in the midst of this steady confusion of constantly varying sensation, sight interrupted by sound, sound mingling with sight, on the swaying, vibrating seat, quivering with the prolonged thrill of the earth, lapsed to a sort of pleasing numbness, in a sense hypnotized by the weaving maze of things in which he found himself involved. To keep his team at an even, regular gait, maintaining the precise interval, to run his furrows as closely as possible to those already made by the plough in front, this for the moment was the entire sum of his duties. But while one part of his brain, alert and watchful, took cognizance of these matters, all the greater part was lulled and stupefied with the long monotony of the affair. The ploughing, now in full swing, enveloped him in a vague, slow-moving whirl of things. Underneath him was the jarring, jolting, trembling machine. Not a clod was turned, not an obstacle encountered, that he did not receive the swift impression of it through all his body. The very friction of the damp soil, sliding incessantly from the shiny surfaces of the shears, seemed to reproduce itself in his fingertips and along the back of his head. He heard the horse hoofs by the myriads crushing down easily, deeply into the loam, the prolonged clinking of trace chains, the working of the smooth brown flanks in the harness, the clatter of wooden hames, the champing of bits, the click of iron shoes against pebbles, the brittle stubble of the surface ground crackling and snapping as the furrows turned, the sonorous, steady breath wrenched from the deep, laboring chests, strap-bound, shining with sweat, and all along the line the voices of the men talking to the horses. Everywhere there were visions of glossy brown backs straining, heaving, swollen with muscle, harness streaked with specks of froth, broad cup-shaped hoofs, heavy with brown loam, men's faces red with tan, blue overalls spotted with axle grease. Muscled hands, the knuckles whitened in their grip on the reins, and through it all the ammoniacal smell of the horses, the bitter reek of perspiration of beasts and men, the aroma of warm leather, the scent of dead stubble, and stronger and more penetrating than everything else, the heavy, enervating odor of the upturned, living earth. At intervals, from the tops of one of the rare low swells of the land, Vanamee overlooked a wider horizon. On the other divisions of Quien-Sabe the same work was in progress. Occasionally he could see another column of plows in the adjoining division, sometimes so close at hand that the subdued murmur of its movements reached his ear, sometimes so distant that it resolved itself into a long brown streak upon the gray of the ground. Farther off to the west, on the Osterman ranch, other columns came and went, and once from the crest of the highest swell on his division, Vanamee caught a distant glimpse of the Broderson ranch. There, too, moving specks indicated that the plowing was under way. And farther away still, far off there beyond the fine line of the horizons, over the curve of the globe, the shoulder of the earth, he knew were other ranches, and beyond these others, and beyond these still others, the immensities multiplying to infinity. Everywhere throughout the great San Joaquin, unseen and unheard, 1,000 plows upstirred the land, tens of thousands of shears clutched deep into the warm, moist soil. It was the long, stroking caress, vigorous, male, powerful, for which the earth seemed panting. The heroic embrace of a multitude of iron hands gripping deep into the brown, warm flesh of the land that quivered responsive and passionate under this rude advance, so robust as to be almost an assault, so violent as to be veritably brutal. There, under the sun and under the speckless sheen of the sky, the wooing of the Titan began, the vast primal passion, the two world forces, the elemental male and female, locked in a colossal embrace, at grapples in the throes of an infinite desire, at once terrible and divine, knowing no law, untamed, savage, natural, sublime. From time to time the gang in which Vanamee worked halted on the signal from foreman or overseer. The horses came to a standstill, the vague clamor of the work lapsed away. Then the minutes passed. The whole work hung suspended. All up and down the line one demanded what had happened. The division superintendent galloped past, perplexed and anxious. For the moment one of the plows was out of order, a bolt had slipped, a lever refused to work, or a machine had become immobilized in heavy ground, or a horse had lamed himself. Once even, toward noon, an entire plow was taken out of the line, so out of gear that a messenger had to be sent to the division forge to summon the machinist. Annixter had disappeared. He had ridden farther on to the other divisions of his ranch to watch the work in progress there. At 12 o'clock, according to his orders, all the division superintendents put themselves in communication with him by means of the telephone wires that connected each of the division houses, reporting the condition of the work, the number of acres covered, the prospects of each plow traversing its daily average of 20 miles. At 12:30, Vanamee and the rest of the drivers ate their lunch in the field, the tin buckets having been distributed to them that morning after breakfast. But in the evening the routine of the previous day was repeated, and Vanamee, unharnessing his team, riding one horse and leading the others, returned to the division barns and bunkhouse. It was between 6 and 7 o'clock. The 100 men of the gang threw themselves upon the supper the Chinese cooks had set out in the shed of the eating-house, long as a bowling alley, unpainted, crude, the seats benches, the table covered with oilcloth. Overhead 6 kerosene lamps flared and smoked. The table was taken as if by assault. The clatter of iron knives upon the tin plates was as the reverberation of hail upon a metal roof. The ploughmen rinsed their throats with great draughts of wine, and, their elbows wide, their foreheads flushed, resumed their attack upon the beef and bread, eating as though they would never have enough. All up and down the long table, where the kerosene lamps reflected themselves deep in the oilcloth cover, one heard the incessant sounds of mastication, and saw the uninterrupted movement of great jaws. At every moment one or another of the men demanded a fresh portion of beef, another pint of wine, another half-loaf of bread. For upwards of an hour the gang ate. It was no longer a supper. It was a veritable barbecue, a crude and primitive feasting, barbaric, Homeric. But in all this scene Vanamee saw nothing repulsive. Presley would have abhorred it, this feeding of the people, this gorging of the human animal, eager for its meat. Vanamee, simple, uncomplicated, living so close to nature and the rudimentary life, understood its significance. He knew very well that within a short half-hour after this meal the men would throw themselves down in their bunks to sleep without moving, inert and stupefied with fatigue, till the morning. Work, food, and sleep, all life reduced to its bare essentials, uncomplex, honest, healthy. They were strong, these men, with the strength of the soil they worked, in touch with the essential things, back again to the starting point of civilization, coarse, vital, real, and sane. For a brief moment immediately after the meal, pipes were lit and the air grew thick with fragrant tobacco smoke. On a corner of the dining-room table a game of poker was begun. One of the drivers, a Swede, produced an accordion. A group on the steps of the bunkhouse listened with alternate gravity and shouts of laughter to the acknowledged storyteller of the gang. But soon the men began to turn in, stretching themselves at full length on the horse blankets in the rack-like bunks. The sounds of heavy breathing increased steadily. Lights were put out, and before the afterglow had faded from the sky, the gang was asleep. Vanamee, however, remained awake. The night was fine, warm, the sky silver-gray with starlight. By and by there would be a moon. In the first watch after the twilight, a faint puff of breeze came up out of the south. From all around, the heavy, penetrating smell of the new-turned earth exhaled steadily into the darkness. After a while, when the moon came up, he could see the vast brown breast of the earth turned toward it. Far off, distant objects came into view. The giant oak tree at Hooven's ranch house near the irrigating ditch on Los Muertos, the skeleton-like tower of the windmill on Annixter's home ranch, the clump of willows along Broderson Creek close to the Long Trestle, and last of all the venerable tower of the Mission of San Juan on the high ground beyond the creek. Thitherward, like homing pigeons, Vanamee's thoughts turned irresistibly. Near to that tower, just beyond in the little hollow, hidden now from his sight, was the seed ranch where Angele Varian had lived. Straining his eyes, peering across the intervening levels, Vanamee fancied he could almost see the line of venerable pear trees in whose shadow she had been accustomed to wait for him. On many such a night as this he had crossed the ranches to find her there. His mind went back to that wonderful time of his life, 16 years before this, when Angele was alive, when they two were involved in the sweet intricacies of a love so fine, so pure, so marvelous, that it seemed to them a miracle, a manifestation, a thing veritably divine put into the life of them and the hearts of them by God himself. To that they had been born. For this love's sake they had come into the world, and the mingling of their lives was to be the perfect life, the intended, ordained union of the soul of man with the soul of woman, indissoluble, harmonious as music, beautiful beyond all thought, a foretaste of heaven, a hostage of immortality. No, he, Vanamee, could never forget. Never was the edge of his grief to lose its sharpness. Never would the lapse of time blunt the tooth of his pain. Once more, as he sat there, looking off across the ranches, his eyes fixed on the ancient campanile of the mission church, the anguish that would not die leaped at his throat, tearing at his heart, shaking him and rending him with a violence as fierce and as profound as if it had all been but yesterday. The ache returned to his heart, a physical keen pain. His hands gripped tight together, twisting, interlocked, his eyes filled with tears, his whole body shaken and riven from head to heel. He had lost her. God had not meant it, after all. The whole matter had been a mistake. That vast, wonderful love that had come upon them had been only the flimsiest mockery. Abruptly Vanamee rose. He knew the night that was before him. At intervals, throughout the course of his prolonged wanderings, in the desert, on the mesa, deep in the canyon, lost and forgotten on the flanks of unnamed mountains, alone under the stars and under the moon's white eye, these hours came to him, his grief recoiling upon him like the recoil of a vast and terrible engine. Then he must fight out the night, wrestling with his sorrow, praying, sometimes incoherent, hardly conscious, asking why of the night and of the stars. Such another night had come to him now. Until dawn he knew he must struggle with his grief, torn with memories. his imagination assaulted with visions of a vanished happiness. If this paroxysm of sorrow was to assail him again that night, there was but one place for him to be. He would go to the mission. He would see Father Soria. He would pass the night in the deep shadow of the aged pear trees in the mission garden. He struck out across Quien-Sabe, his face, the face of an ascetic, lean, brown, infinitely sad, set toward the mission church. In about an hour he reached and crossed the road that led northward from Guadalajara toward the Seed Ranch, and, a little farther on, forded Broderson Creek where it ran through one corner of the mission land. He climbed the hill and halted, out of breath from his brisk walk, at the end of the colonnade of the mission itself. Until this moment, Vanamee had not trusted himself to see the mission at night. On the occasion of his first daytime visit with Presley, he had hurried away even before the twilight had set in, not daring for the moment to face the crowded phantoms that in his imagination filled the mission garden after dark. In the daylight the place had seemed strange to him. None of his associations with the old building and its surroundings were those of sunlight and brightness. Whenever, during his long sojourns in the wilderness of the Southwest, he had called up the picture in the eye of his mind, it had always appeared to him in the dim mystery of moonless nights, the venerable pear trees black with shadow, the fountain a thing to be heard rather than seen. But as yet he had not entered the garden. That lay on the other side of the mission. Vanamee passed down the colonnade, with its uneven pavement of worn red bricks, to the last door by the belfry tower, and rang the little bell by pulling the leather thong that hung from a hole in the door above the knob. But the maidservant, who, after a long interval, opened the door, blinking and confused at being roused from her sleep, told Vanamee that Soria was not in his room. Vanamee, however, was known to her as the priest's protege and great friend, and she allowed him to enter, telling him that, no doubt, he would find Soria in the church itself. The servant led the way down the cool adobe passage to a larger room that occupied the entire width of the bottom of the belfry tower, and whence a flight of aged steps led upward into the dark. At the foot of the stairs was a door opening into the church. The servant admitted Vanamee, closing the door behind her. The interior of the mission, a great oblong of whitewashed adobe with a flat ceiling, was lighted dimly by the sanctuary lamp that hung from 3 long chains just over the chancel rail at the far end of the church, and by 2 or 3 cheap kerosene lamps in brackets of imitation bronze. All around the walls was the inevitable series of pictures representing the Stations of the Cross. They were of a hideous crudity of design and composition, yet were wrought out with an innocent, unquestioning sincerity that was not without its charm. Each picture, framed alike in gilt, bore its suitable inscription in staring black letters. Simon, the Cyrenian, helps Jesus to carry his cross. Saint Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. Jesus falls for the 4th time, and so on. Halfway up the length of the church the pews began, coffin-like boxes of blackened oak, shining from years of friction, each with its door, while over them, and built out from the wall, was the pulpit, with its tarnished gilt sounding-board above it, like the raised cover of a great hat-box. Between the pews, in the aisle, the violent vermilion of a strip of ingrained carpet assaulted the eye. Farther on were the steps to the altar, the chancel rail of worm-riddled oak, the high altar with its napery from the bargain counters of a San Francisco store, the massive silver candlesticks, each as much as one man could lift, the gift of a dead Spanish queen, and last, the pictures of the chancel, the Virgin in a glory, a Christ in agony on the cross, and St. John the Baptist, the patron saint of the mission, the San Juan Bautista of the early days, a gaunt, gray figure in skins, 2 fingers upraised in the gesture of benediction. The air of the place was cool and damp, and heavy with the flat, sweet scent of stale incense smoke. It was of a vault-like stillness, and the closing of the door behind Vanamee re-echoed from corner to corner with a prolonged reverberation of thunder. However, Father Soria was not in the church. Vanamee took a couple of turns the length of the aisle, looking about into the chapels on either side of the chancel. But the building was deserted. The priest had been there recently, nevertheless, for the altar furniture was in disarray, as though he had been rearranging it but a moment before. On both sides of the church and halfway up their length the walls were pierced by low archways, in which were massive wooden doors, clamped with iron bolts. One of these doors, on the pulpit side of the church, stood ajar, and stepping to it and pushing it wide open, Vanamee looked diagonally across a little patch of vegetables, beets, radishes, and lettuce, to the rear of the building that had once contained the cloisters, and through an open window saw Father Soria diligently polishing the silver crucifix that usually stood on the high altar. Vanamee did not call to the priest. Putting a finger to either temple, he fixed his eyes steadily upon him for a moment as he moved about at his work. In a few seconds he closed his eyes, but only part way. The pupils contracted, his forehead lowered to an expression of poignant intensity. Soon afterward he saw the priest pause abruptly in the act of drawing the cover over the crucifix, looking about him from side to side. He turned again to his work, and again came to a stop, perplexed, curious. With uncertain steps, and evidently wondering why he did so, he came to the door of the room and opened it, looking out into the night. Vanamee, hidden in the deep shadow of the archway, did not move, but his eyes closed, and the intense expression deepened on his face. The priest hesitated, moved forward a step, turned back, paused again, then came straight across the garden patch, brusquely colliding with Vanamee, still motionless in the recess of the archway. Soria gave a great start, catching his breath. Oh, it's you! Was it you I heard calling?" "No, I could not have heard. I remember now. What a strange power! I am not sure that it is right to do this thing, Vanamee. I had to come. I do not know why. It is a great force, a power. I don't like it. Vanamee, sometimes it frightens me." Vanamee put his chin in the air. "If I had wanted to, sir, I could have made you come to me from back there in the Quien-Sabe ranch." The priest shook his head. "It troubles me," he said, "to think that my own will can count for so little. Just now I could not resist. If a deep river had been between us, I must have crossed it. Suppose I had been asleep now." "It would have been all the easier," answered Vanamee. "I understand as little of these things as you. But I think if you had been asleep, your power of resistance would have been so much the more weakened. Perhaps I should not have waked. Perhaps I should have come to you in my sleep. Perhaps." Soria crossed himself. "It is occult," he hazarded. "No, I do not like it. Dear fellow," he put his hand on Vanamee's shoulder, "don't call me that way again. Promise. See," he held out his hand, "I am all of a tremble. There, we won't speak of it further. Wait for me a moment. I have only to put the cross in its place and a fresh altar cloth, and then I am done. Tomorrow is the feast of the Holy Cross, and I am preparing against it. The night is fine. We will smoke a cigar in the cloister garden." A few moments later the two passed out of the door on the other side of the church, opposite the pulpit, Soria adjusting a silk skull-cap on his tonsured head. He wore his cassock now, and was far more the churchman in appearance than when Vanamee and Presley had seen him on a former occasion. They were now in the cloister garden. The place was charming. Everywhere grew clumps of palms and magnolia trees. A grapevine, over a century old, occupied a trellis in one angle of the walls which surrounded the garden on two sides. Along the third side was the church itself, while the fourth was open, the wall having crumbled away, its site marked only by a line of 8 great pear trees, older even than the grapevine, gnarled, twisted, bearing no fruit. Directly opposite the pear trees, in the south wall of the garden, was a round, arched portal, whose gate giving upon the esplanade in front of the mission was always closed. Small gravelled walks, well kept, bordered with mignonette, twisted about among the flower beds and underneath the magnolia trees. In the center was a little fountain in a stone basin green with moss, while just beyond, between the fountain and the pear trees, stood what was left of a sundial, the bronze gnomon, green with the beatings of the weather, the figures on the half-circle of the dial worn away, illegible. But on the other side of the fountain, and directly opposite the door of the mission, ranged against the wall, were 9 graves, 3 with headstones, the rest with slabs. 2 of Soria's predecessors were buried here. 3 of the graves were those of mission Indians. One was thought to contain a former alcalde of Guadalajara, 2 more held the bodies of De la Cuesta and his young wife, taking with her to the grave the illusion of her husband's love, and the last one, the 9th, at the end of the line, nearest the pear trees, was marked by a little headstone, the smallest of any, on which, together with the proper dates, only 16 years apart, was cut the name Angele Varian. But the quiet, the repose, the isolation of the little cloister garden was infinitely delicious. It was a tiny corner of the great valley that stretched in all directions around it, shut off, discreet, romantic, a garden of dreams, of enchantments, of illusions. Outside there, far off, the great grim world went clashing through its grooves. But in here never an echo of the grinding of its wheels entered to jar upon the subdued modulation of the fountain's uninterrupted murmur. Sarria and Vanamee found their way to a stone bench against the side wall of the mission, near the door from which they had just issued, and sat down, Sarria lighting a cigar, Vanamee rolling and smoking cigarettes in Mexican fashion. All about them widened the vast calm night. All the stars were out. The moon was coming up. There was no wind, no sound. The insistent flowing of the fountain seemed only as the symbol of the passing of time, a thing that was understood rather than heard, inevitable, prolonged. At long intervals a faint breeze, hardly more than a breath, found its way into the garden over the enclosing walls, and passed overhead, spreading everywhere the delicious mingled perfume of magnolia blossoms, of mignonette, of moss, of grass, and all the calm green life silently teeming within the enclosure of the walls. From where he sat, Vanamee, turning his head, could look out underneath the pear trees to the north. Close at hand, a little valley lay between the high ground on which the mission was built and the line of low hills just beyond Broderson Creek on the Quien-Sabe. In here was the Seed Ranch, which Angele's people had cultivated, a unique and beautiful stretch of 500 acres, planted thick with roses, violets, lilies, tulips, iris, carnations, tuberoses, poppies, heliotrope, all manner and description of flowers, 500 acres of them, solid, thick, exuberant, blooming and fading, leaving their seed or slips to be marketed broadcast all over the United States. This had been the vocation of Angele's parents, raising flowers for their seeds. All over the country the Seed Ranch was known. Now it was arid, almost dry, but when in full flower toward the middle of summer, the sight of these 5,000 acres, royal with color, vermilion, azure, flaming yellow, was a marvel. When an east wind blew, men on the streets of Bonneville, nearly 12 miles away, could catch the scent of this valley of flowers, this chaos of perfume. And into this life of flowers, this world of color, this atmosphere oppressive and clogged and cloyed and thickened with sweet odor, Angele had been born. There she had lived for 16 years. There she had died. It was not surprising that Vanamee, with his intense, delicate sensitiveness to beauty, his almost abnormal capacity for great happiness, had been drawn to her, had loved her so deeply. She came to him from out of the flowers, the smell of the roses in her hair of gold that hung in 2 straight plaits on either side of her face, the reflection of the violets in the profound dark blue of her eyes, perplexing, heavy-lidded, almond-shaped, oriental, the aroma and the imperial red of the carnations in her lips, with their almost Egyptian fullness, the whiteness of the lilies, the perfume of the lilies, and the lily's slender balancing grace in her neck. Her hands disengaged the odor of the heliotropes. The folds of her dress gave off the enervating scent of poppies. Her feet were redolent of hyacinths. For a long time after sitting down upon the bench, neither the priest nor Vanamee spoke. But after a while Sarria took his cigar from his lips, saying, "How still it is! This is a beautiful old garden, peaceful, very quiet. Some day I shall be buried here. I like to remember that. And you too, Vanamee." "Quien-Sabe." "Yes, you too. Where else?" "No, it is better here, yonder by the side of the little girl." "I am not able to look forward yet, sir. The things that are to be are somehow nothing to me at all. For me they amount to nothing." "They amount to everything, my boy." "Yes, to one part of me, but not to the part of me that belonged to Angele, the best part. Oh, you don't know," he exclaimed with a sudden movement. "No one can understand. What is it to me when you tell me that sometime after I shall die, too, somewhere in a vague place you call heaven, I shall see her again? Do you think that the idea of that ever made anyone's sorrow easier to bear, ever took the edge from anyone's grief? But you believe that—" "Oh, believe, believe," echoed the other. "What do I believe? I don't know. I believe or I don't believe. I can remember what she was, but I cannot hope what she will be. Hope, after all, is only memory seen reversed. When I try to see her in another life, whatever you call it, in heaven, beyond the grave, this place of yours, when I try to see her there, she comes to my imagination only as what she was, material, earthly, as I loved her. Imperfect, you say, but that is as I saw her, and as I saw her I loved her, and as she was, material, earthly, imperfect, she loved me. It's that I want," he exclaimed. "I don't want her changed. I don't want her spiritualized, exalted, glorified, celestial. I want her. I think it is only this feeling that has kept me from killing myself. I would rather be unhappy in the memory of what she actually was than be happy in the realization of her transformed, changed, made celestial. I am only human. Her soul, that was beautiful, no doubt, but again it was something very vague, intangible, hardly more than a phrase. But the touch of her hand was real, the sound of her voice was real, the clasp of her arms about my neck was real. "Oh," he cried, shaken with a sudden wrench of passion, "give those back to me. Tell your God to give those back to me, the sound of her voice, the touch of her hand, the clasp of her dear arms, real, real, and then you may talk to me of heaven." Sarria shook his head. "But when you meet her again," he observed, "in heaven, you too will be changed. You will see her spiritualized with spiritual eyes. As she is now, she does not appeal to you. I understand that. It is because, as you say, you are only human, while she is divine. But when you come to be like her, as she is now, you will know her as she really is, not as she seemed to be, because her voice was sweet, because her hair was pretty, because her hand was warm in yours. Vanamee, your talk is that of a foolish child. You are like one of the Corinthians to whom Paul wrote. Do you remember? Listen now. I can recall the words, and such words, beautiful and terrible at the same time, such a majesty. They march like soldiers with trumpets. But some men will say, as you have said just now, how are the dead raised up, and with what body do they come? Thou fool! That which thou sowest is not quickened except it die, and that which thou sowest not that body that shall be, but bare grain. It may chance of wheat or of some other grain. But God giveth it a body as it hath pleased him, and to every seed his own body. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. It is because you are a natural body that you cannot understand her, nor wish for her as a spiritual body. But when you are both spiritual, then you shall know each other as you are, know as you never knew before. Your grain of wheat is your symbol of immortality. You bury it in the earth. It dies and rises again 1,000 times more beautiful. Vanamee, your dear girl was only a grain of humanity that we have buried here, and the end is not yet. But all this is so old, so old. The world learned it 1,000 years ago, and yet each man that has ever stood by the open grave of anyone he loved must learn it all over again from the beginning. Vanamee was silent for a moment, looking off with unseeing eyes between the trunks of the pear trees over the little valley. "That may all be as you say," he answered after a while. "I have not learned it yet, in any case. Now I only know that I love her, oh, as if it all were yesterday, and that I am suffering, always." He leaned forward, his head supported on his clenched fists, the infinite sadness of his face deepening like a shadow, the tears brimming in his deep-set eyes. A question that he must ask, which involved the thing that was scarcely to be thought of, occurred to him at this moment. After hesitating for a long moment, he said, "I have been away a long time, and I have had no news of this place since I left. Is there anything to tell, Father? Has any discovery been made, any suspicion developed as to the other?" The priest shook his head. "Not a word, not a whisper. It is a mystery. It always will be.